The morning Gerald Whitmore called his 3 sons into his study. He had already made up his mind. There were no pleasantries, no coffee on the side table, no football game murmuring from the television down the hall. Just Gerald sitting behind his oak desk with his hands folded, and 3 grown men standing in the room they had spent most of their childhoods trying to avoid. "Sit down," he said. They sat. Gerald was 61 years old and had built Whitmore Logistics from a single cargo van and a rented storage unit in Mississauga into a company that moved freight across 7 provinces. He had done it without a business degree, without a family inheritance, and without a wife after Sandra passed when the boys were still in school. People in the industry called him tough. His sons called him something else, though never to his face. He looked at each of them in turn. Brendan, the oldest, 38, who ran the company's eastern operations and wore his father's ambition like a tailored suit. Cody, 35, who had married well and spent most of his time entertaining clients on golf courses in Oakville. And then there was the youngest, Reed, 32, who had walked away from Whitmore Logistics 4 years ago to work as a site supervisor for a mid-sized construction company in Hamilton. Gerald had not fully forgiven him for that, or perhaps he had never tried. "I've been thinking," Gerald said, "about what I'm going to leave behind." Brendan straightened in his chair. Cody uncrossed his legs. Reed said nothing. "Not the company. Not the house. I mean what I'm actually going to leave behind." Gerald tapped the side of his head. "What's in here? What I know. And I've come to realize you don't know any of it." "Not really, Dad," Brendan started. "I'm not finished." Brendan closed his mouth. Gerald reached into the desk drawer and set 3 plain envelopes on the wood between them. Each one had a name written on it in his handwriting, the kind of handwriting that looked like it had never been taught, just forced into existence by necessity. Inside each of those is $40, cash. Cody let out a short laugh before he caught himself. Gerald didn't react. "You're each going to take that envelope and leave this house on Friday morning. No credit cards. No using your wife's account, Cody. No company card, Brendan. No calling anyone who works for me. You have 1 week. You come back next Friday. And do what exactly?" Brendan asked. "Live," Gerald said. "Eat, sleep somewhere, figure it out." He paused. "The same way I did when I was 22 and had nothing. The same way your mother did when she first came to this country with less than that in her pocket." The room went quiet in a way that felt different from ordinary silence. Reed was the only one who didn't look at the envelopes. He was looking at his father. "I'm not doing this to punish you," Gerald said. "I want you to understand something before I'm not around to explain it." Brendan took his envelope and left the room, already composing the workaround in his head. He wasn't going to starve for a week to prove something to his father. That wasn't stubbornness. That was efficiency. He had logistics in his blood, and the first rule of logistics was that you used every resource available to you. By Saturday morning, Brendan had checked himself into a mid-range hotel in Toronto, using a card he'd set up years ago under the company's hospitality account. The one that technically wasn't his personal card, which meant technically he wasn't breaking any rules. He told himself this with the comfortable confidence of a man who had spent a decade finding the edge of his father's expectations and standing precisely on it. He spent $40 on a grocery run: bread, peanut butter, instant noodles, a small jar of coffee. He ate in the hotel room and worked remotely on his laptop, which he had also technically not been told to leave behind. By Tuesday he was bored, by Wednesday he was irritated, and by Thursday he had convinced himself that the exercise had confirmed what he already believed, that preparation and network were the same thing as character. He arrived home Friday morning looking mildly inconvenienced. Cody had a different plan, which was to not really have a plan, because in his experience, things had a way of working out when you were charming and patient, and willing to let other people feel like they were helping you. He drove to Niagara-on-the-Lake, which he had always found restorative, checked into a bed and breakfast using his wife Paige's emergency credit card, which he justified on the grounds that a medical emergency could theoretically arise at any point, and spent the first 3 days eating well, walking the waterfront, and calling it reflection, On day 4, he ran into a university friend who happened to be visiting with his family, and they spent the next 2 evenings eating at the friend's rental cottage. Cody contributed a $12 bottle of wine from his 40 and called it reciprocal generosity. He drove home Thursday night, a day early, because he missed his own bed and there was a match on. He arrived Friday morning looking well-rested. Reed had not brought a bag. He had thought about it on Thursday night, standing in the spare bedroom of the Hamilton apartment he rented with a view of the escarpment. He held the envelope in one hand and looked at what he owned. A single bed with a decent mattress, a bookshelf, work boots by the door, a rain jacket hanging on a hook. He had built a life that fit inside a modest space. He had done it on purpose. He put $40 in his jacket pocket on Friday morning and took the GO train into Toronto. He didn't have a plan. He had spent 4 years learning that plans on job sites either worked or they didn't, and what mattered was what you did in the gap between the two. He found a hostel on Spadina that cost $22 a night. He booked 2 nights, which ate through most of his money, and then he stood on the sidewalk outside with $18 and change and tried to think clearly. He was hungry. He bought a falafel wrap from a counter place on Dundas for $6 and ate it on a bench in Kensington Market, watching the neighborhood wake up around him. He thought about his mother. She had come to Canada from Jamaica at 19 with $200 and a cousin's phone number. She had worked as a cleaner at a Scarborough hotel for 3 years before she met Gerald. She used to say, when the boys were small, that the best thing the hard years had given her was the ability to tell the difference between what she needed and what she thought she needed. That was a distinction, she said, that most people never learned. Reed had not thought about that in a long time. He spent Saturday morning walking. He walked east along Queen, then down to the lake, then back up through the market. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was noticing things. The way the city smelled different at 7 in the morning than it did at noon. The way the older men gathered outside the Portuguese cafe on Augusta sat with their coffee like they had nowhere else to be and were grateful for it. By mid-morning, he ended up at a community drop-in center on College Street. He hadn't planned to go inside. He walked past it twice, and then on the 3rd pass, he read the sign in the window. Volunteers welcome. Kitchen help needed 10 to 2. He pushed the door open. The woman running the kitchen was named Dorothy, and she was 67 years old and moved like someone who had decided long ago that efficiency was a form of respect. She handed Reed an apron without being asked if he'd worked in a kitchen before. He hadn't, but he was good at following instructions, and within 20 minutes, he was chopping onions and listening to Dorothy explain, without pausing her own work, that the center served about 80 people on weekdays, and sometimes more on the weekend. Are most of them regulars? Reed asked. Most of them, she said. Some of them just need a hot meal. Some of them need to be somewhere that isn't the street. She glanced at him sideways. You from around here? Hamilton, he said. What brings you to Toronto? He thought for a moment. My father wanted me to understand something. Dorothy considered this. And are you? He looked at the onions. I think I'm starting to. He volunteered until 2, ate lunch with the other volunteers, a bowl of vegetable soup and half a sandwich, and walked out into the afternoon with $12 and the knowledge that he had just eaten the best meal he'd had all week. He found day labor on Sunday. He'd seen the posting on a bulletin board inside the hostel. General labor, cash daily, sunrise to 3 p.m., ask for Tremaine. He showed up at the address, a warehouse loading dock in the junction, at 5:45 in the morning. There were 9 other men already there, most of them older than him, some of them in work gear that had clearly been slept in. Tremaine was a man of about 50 with a clipboard and a permanent expression of mild skepticism. He looked Reed over and said, You done loading before? I'm a site supervisor, Reed said. Construction, so yes. Tremaine said and handed him a safety vest. They loaded and unloaded freight for 8 hours. It was the kind of physical work that didn't leave room for much thought, which Reed found clarifying in a way he hadn't expected. His hands remembered things his mind had almost forgotten. The weight of a box, the angle of a dolly, The way to use your legs and not your back. He had done this kind of work when he was 20, saving money before he got his first site job. He earned $60 at the end of the day. He stood on the dock with the cash in his hand and felt something he could only describe, later, as proportion. The sense that he now had a clear sense of what a day of this work was actually worth, measured in effort and time, and the ache in his shoulders. He walked back to the hostel. He bought a sandwich and a coffee on the way. He booked another 2 nights with the hostel money, and he had enough left for food for the rest of the week. He went back to Dorothy's kitchen on Monday. On Tuesday, a man came into the drop-in center and sat down at one of the tables near the window. He was somewhere in his late 50s, wearing a fleece vest over a dress shirt, and he sat with the particular stillness of someone who didn't usually sit in places like this. He looked around the room like he was trying to orient himself to something. Dorothy nodded toward him when she passed Reed at the counter. He's been in twice this week. Doesn't eat much. Just sits. Reed brought the man a cup of coffee without being asked. The man looked up. "I didn't order anything," he said. "It's on the house," Reed said. "Everything here is." The man looked at the coffee and then back at Reed. "First time I've been somewhere in years where something was on the house," he said. It didn't sound like a joke. His name was Lawrence. He had worked for 26 years in commercial insurance and been let go in a restructuring 8 months ago. He was 59. He had a mortgage in Etobicoke, a daughter in her 2nd year at Western, and a wife who had gone back to work part-time but whose salary covered less than half of what their life cost. "I come here," he said carefully, "because I needed somewhere to go that wasn't my house. I can't sit in my house. My wife looks at me and tries not to show that she's scared, and I can't." He stopped. "I come here." Reed sat down across from him. He wasn't sure why. He just did. They talked for an hour. Lawrence told him about the job search, the interviews that went to people 20 years younger, the recruiters who never called back. Reed told him about Hamilton, about leaving his father's company, about the way a decision that had felt like freedom at the time sometimes felt like a door you couldn't reopen. "Do you regret it?" Lawrence asked. Reed thought about it honestly. "No," he said, "but I think I misunderstood what I was walking away from." Lawrence nodded like that meant something to him. Before Reed left that afternoon, Lawrence shook his hand at the door. "You're the first person who just sat down," Lawrence said. "In 8 months. Just sat down and didn't need something from me." Reed walked out onto College Street and stood in the late afternoon sun for a moment. The city moved around him. He thought about what his mother used to say. He thought about Dorothy's kitchen and the weight of a loaded dolly and Lawrence's face when someone sat across from him without an agenda. He understood, suddenly and completely, what his father had been trying to say. He got back to Mississauga on Thursday evening, a day early. Gerald was in the kitchen when Reed came in. He looked up from the stovetop and said nothing for a moment. "You're early," he said. "I know. How was it?" Reed set his jacket on the hook by the door. He sat down at the kitchen table. "Hard," he said. "Good." Gerald turned back to the stove. He was making something simple, pasta, by the smell of it. He had always been a plain cook, functional and unpretentious. "I worked a loading dock," Reed said, "and I volunteered at a drop-in center. I met a man named Lawrence. He worked in insurance for 26 years, and he can't find a job, and he's been going to a community center just so he has somewhere to sit that isn't his house." He paused. "I thought about Mom a lot." Gerald didn't turn around, but his shoulders shifted slightly. "She would have understood this immediately," Reed said. "The whole week. She would have understood it in 5 minutes." "Yes," Gerald said quietly. "She would have." They sat in silence while the water came to a boil. It was not uncomfortable. It was the first silence Reed could remember sitting in with his father that didn't feel like distance. "I left her out of it," Gerald said eventually. "When I talked to you boys about building things, about earning, I left her out of it. I didn't know how to put her into it without." He stopped. "I just didn't." "I know," Reed said. "She would have done this better." "Probably," Reed said. "But you did it." Gerald set 2 bowls on the table without being asked if Reed was staying. That was, Reed thought, its own kind of language. Brendan arrived Friday morning at 9 with the slightly proprietary air of a man who expected to be told he had won something. Cody arrived at 9:10, looking rested and faintly pleased with himself. Gerald made coffee and the four of them sat in the living room. He asked each of them what the week had been like. Brendan described his solution with the efficiency of a man delivering a project report. The hotel, the groceries, the remote work. I managed the situation, he said. I identified the constraints and I worked within them. Gerald listened without expression. Cody told a version of the week that featured primarily scenery and coincidence. It was actually a really good reset, he said. I think that's the word. A reset. Gerald nodded slowly. Then he looked at Reed. Reed didn't have a presentation. He told it the way it had happened. The hostel on Spadina, Dorothy and her kitchen, the loading dock in Tremaine, Lawrence at the window table, the $60, the way the falafel wrap on the bench in Kensington Market had been the most present he had felt in years. When he finished, the room was quiet. Brendan looked at his hands. Cody looked out the window. I didn't do it the right way, Brendan said eventually. He said it to the room, not to Gerald. I knew that going in. I told myself it didn't matter. Gerald looked at him. Why did you do it that way? Brendan thought about it, really thought about it for perhaps the first time. Because I was afraid, he said, of what it would mean if I couldn't do it. That was, Reed thought, the most honest thing his brother had said in 10 years. Cody said nothing for a while. Then, I spent $40 on wine. He said it flatly. 12 of it anyway. For someone else's dinner. He shook his head. I don't know what I thought that was. Gerald didn't lecture them. He didn't say I told you so or draw conclusions or assign moral grades. He sat in the armchair by the window, where he had sat every Sunday morning for 40 years, and he let the room be what it was. Your mother had nothing when she came here, he said. I had nothing when I started. I don't mean we were poor in some character-building way. I mean we had nothing. No floor, no net, no one to call. He looked at his hands. I watched you three grow up with every floor I'd built under you, and I kept building more, and somewhere I lost track of whether you knew the floors were there, whether you'd ever had to think about them. He looked at Reed. You knew, he said. You figured that out when you left. I was angry about it, but you figured it out. He paused. I wasn't fair to you for that. Reed didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The company will go to whoever is ready to run it, Gerald said. I haven't decided that yet. Maybe it goes to all three of you. Maybe it goes to none of you and I find someone who's hungry enough to carry it properly. He looked at each of them in turn. But that's not what this week was about. He stood up, which was Gerald's way of ending a conversation. Your mother walked through that door in 1984 with 2 suitcases and a phone number on a piece of paper, he said. She built her whole life in this country with those 2 suitcases and her own hands. He moved toward the kitchen. I just wanted you to know what that felt like. Even a little. 3 months later, Reed drove back to Toronto on a Saturday morning. He brought a carton of muffins and left them on the counter at Dorothy's kitchen. She looked at the muffins and then at him and said, with the particular economy of a woman who didn't waste words, blueberry. Good. He worked the lunch shift, chopped carrots, and ate with the volunteers after. On his way out, he checked the back table near the window. Lawrence wasn't there, he asked Dorothy. Got something, she said. Smaller firm, not what he had, but something. She shrugged in the way she shrugged at things that were exactly as they should be. Reed walked out onto College Street. It was a cold morning, the kind of October cold that settled into your collar and reminded you that winter was not a metaphor. He turned up his jacket and started toward the subway. He called his father from the platform. Gerald picked up on the second ring, which was unusual. He generally preferred to let it ring through and call back on his own terms. I'm in Toronto, Reed said. Dorothy says Lawrence got a job. A pause. Who's Lawrence? I told you about him. The insurance guy. Used to come in and sit by the window. Right, Gerald said. Good. Yeah, Reed said. It is. The train came. Reed got on. They stayed on the line for a moment without speaking, the way you do with someone when the call isn't really about information. Reed, his father said. Yeah, next time you go in there, bring something other than blueberry. Dorothy doesn't like blueberry. Reed laughed. It came out surprised, which was how the best laughs usually did. How do you know what Dorothy likes? I was there Wednesday, Gerald said. And then, before Reed could respond, she prefers cranberry orange. The train moved into the tunnel. The line crackled and dropped. Reed stood, with the phone in his hand, and looked at his reflection in the dark window of the subway car and thought about floors. About the ones that get built beneath you, without your knowing. About the ones you have to build yourself. About how the difference between the two, once you understand it, changes everything. Not because one is better, but because you finally know which one you're standing on. He put his phone in his pocket. Outside the window, the tunnel opened into light.